Hello, Asuminari here again with more how-to tanking. This how-to is about Spell Reflect, Dark Simulacrum, and other dungeon shenanigans. The focus of this video will be filled with tactics involving aforementioned spells, and the fact that they're widely underutilized in dungeon groups. These tactics are especially more useful on challenge mode or mythic difficulty dungeons for groups who are struggling with damage requirements. How it works is normally Spell Reflect and Dark Sim are only supposed to be used on spells like Fireball or Lightning Bolt, a very obvious direct cast on the player. Due to the way Blizzard programs certain boss abilities that target a specific area, it's possible to reflect the debuff you would normally receive by standing in that AoE, or stock a copy of a very powerful boss ability to throw back onto enemies. Blizzard has tuned the damage of these effects way up in recent years to get players to pay attention and not stand in fire. How about we get the bosses to do that instead? Super important to note, before you try any of these yourself, remember that you have to have the Spell Reflect active before stepping foot into the fire, or else you will just sit there and take a ton of damage for no reason. Warriors can use their own Spell Reflect to apply some of these abilities, but for added effect, you can spec into Mass Spell Reflect to give the 5-second window to your whole party. If you have any hunters in the group and they happen to have Deterrence Glyph a la Mirrored Blades, they can also contribute. The best effect, however, hands down goes to Shamans. With the Grounding Totem Glyph, all party members will be blanketed for 15 seconds of this glorious cheesing Spell Reflect. As for Death Knights, I highly recommend that you keep the Glyph of Dark Simulacrum handy. Some dungeons will allow frequent use of Dark Sim on potent spells that it's worth considering dropping other major glyphs for. Let's take a look at Skyreach to start things off. The first boss, Ranjit, has 2 spells that can be reflected onto him. Both of them are his wind wall effects, but they're counted separately, and this is actually going to be pretty useful. While you have a Spell Reflect buff active, run through the shuriken in the middle of his wind wall or 4 winds effect to lay a dot on him that deals the same damage you would take if you were stood in it. Again, while reflecting, you are not receiving the debuff, so don't worry, it won't get you killed. I recommend you track it with a weak aura or tell me when, so you aren't stood in these too long. Wind Wall will not stack multiple times, so it only ever needs to be done once by one person, but just a moment ago I mentioned it was great that the 2 spells are separate abilities. That's because you can debuff the boss with both Wind Wall and 4 winds during the encounter. These abilities do scale with the dungeon difficulty, so its damage will only be stronger on Mythic and Challenge mode. As for some shenanigans, if you happen to have a Goblin Glider or the Glider pack from Engineers, you can skip the Wind Gauntlet after the second boss. Just be careful, because if you screw this up, you'll die immediately, but it is one of the more satisfying stunts you can pull off in the dungeon. As for the last boss, this one's pretty tricky, but the ad that spawns to take players off the map can be stunned while in the air. So warriors with Stormbolt or paladins with Hammer of Justice, you can stun this ad before he attempts to cast down your party members. If you're successful, this ad won't actually try to pick someone up after it gets out of the stun, so he can be passively cleaved down instead of getting focused. Next we'll be taking a look at Auchindoun. This one's much harder to notice because it won't leave a debuff on the boss, but the reflected damage is tracked in logs. Using Spell Reflect, stand on Sanctified Ground's holy lines to reflect its damage onto the boss. This one gets reflected per person, so the more reflects you have, the better. This one really benefits from stacking multiple folks together. Check the link in the description to watch Darkmech and his friends disintegrate this boss. Tanks are often viewed as a leader, so don't be shy about coordinating your group and inspiring them to great feats like this. I promise you that the results are well worth the effort. Auchindoun has a fair amount of dots you can Dark Sim from mobs and Chaos Bolts later on from the Imps, so while there's no super gimmicky sims here, it's still worth it to glyph the ability for extra damage throughout the dungeon. And before we leave Auchindoun, we'll talk about something for you druids. I've mentioned in previous videos that Death Knights have the super enviable Gorefiend's Grasp, but using Ursul's Vortex and Typhoon, you can achieve very similar effects to make quick work of the last pack of imps in this hallway. Now let's talk about Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. Again, not a whole lot of crazy sims yet. We'll get there, but for now, if Death Knights are looking for something with some oomph to steal, try grabbing Shadow Word Frailty off any of the Bone Menders. There are 2 notable reflects in this dungeon, the first of which being on the second boss. During Nalish's Void Devastation after his Possessed Soul phase, you can reflect the Void Pools onto the boss. This is a pretty nasty dot to leave on the boss, so it should help finish him up nice and quick. My favorite reflect is the second one against Ner'zhul, or rather, against his Ritual of Bones. The shadowy death effect used by the skeletons can actually be reflected onto them, essentially two-shotting the bones. Nobody has to switch to them at all. Just let your Spell Reflect take care of the work. Do note that it will take multiple ticks to kill the bones, so if your Spell Reflect is going to wear off, be ready to jump out or finish the ads off yourself. Now Slag Mines is a bit more notorious for Dark Sims. I haven't forgotten about you Death Knights. Remember, the tank or not, you can use these abilities to help the group out. During the encounter with Gogda, he'll start to cast Magma Barrage. When he does, use Dark Sim on him at any point, and then have a party member or yourself stand in a barrage. This will hurt, but you'll be granted a copy of the spell to use on Gogdor Magmolitus. The ads that are up when Magmolitus spawns also cast this spell, but it can be more difficult to try and sim if you don't take care of them quickly afterwards. At the end of Slag Mines, you'll find the Flame Speaker mages casting a Channel Flame ability. Sim the mage, take a tick of the flame's damage, and then feel free to lay it on the boss himself. Keeping one mage alive just to keep simming him through the fight is well worth the effort. Otherwise, this ability can also be reflected onto each mage with the Spell Reflect buff active. Now for the Gorgon trio. Let's look at Everbloom first for more Dark Sim fun. There are quite a few sims here, and the first one is available immediately. The Tenders cast an Enraged Growth on random ads, and you can do the same thing. If you cast it on a friendly player, you'll have to channel it to maintain the effect, but casting it on yourself will allow you to continue using abilities. Be careful not to target enemy mobs, since you can still cast it on them too. The council fight will pretty much boil down to nuking Gola, while Dulu and Telu choke under brambles. When Telu casts a bramble patch, let it go through. Sim Telu and take a tick of the bramble patch. Now you can throw the dot on Dulu. You'll want to throw it on Dulu because if you have a spell reflect, you can reflect the same spell on Telu just by walking over it. Even if you can't reflect it, Dulu is more troublesome since you can just interrupt and stun Telu from his abilities, and Dulu has way more HP than the other two do. The second sim is off the Putrid Pyromancers. Their Dragon's Breath is a channeled cast, and yes, you can sim this ability. Make sure you save Anti-Magic Shell for when you try to sim it so you aren't dazed. This spell hurts and will melt everything in its path, but the catch is, if you turn your character at all once you begin channeling, the spell will break. You have to sim the ability, get yourself in position, and then sit still as you channel the breath. Very difficult to make use of, but worth keeping a Pyromancer up to continually sim him during Archmage Soul's encounter. During the encounter with Archmage Soul, you can also reflect her Frozen Rain. Bring her into her Frost phase and let her Rain help whittle her down. Just be careful not to accidentally reflect a Frostbolt before you debuff her. Lastly, it is possible to sim the Noxious Breath off the Vicious Mandragora in the fight with Yalnu. With all the ads that spawn, this one can be a bit trickier to correctly sim, but it'll do quite a bit of ticking damage to the boss for the rest of the encounter. Oh, and as for one more rather annoying shenanigan, it's possible to skip a ton of the trash in this dungeon using some good old-fashioned wall jumping. The first one is much more difficult than the second, and the ease varies based on which mount you use. The second one, however, is entirely free and rarely takes more than a few attempts to climb up. For this particular spot, you'll want to use a very large mount. Only Clefthoof, Grunling, Yetis, Yaks, Mammoth, and Corehounds work on this trick, to my knowledge. Moving up to Grimrail, this one has some of the weirder reflects. A Shaman spell reflect will be infinitely more potent here, but a warrior can still do them. On the first boss, when Borka goes down, Rocket Spark will start using New Plan to bombard all players with rockets. A Mass Spell Reflect or a Shaman's Grounding Totem will continually reflect this ability back at him. The second boss has one of the best reflects I've seen. While Nitrog is hidden in his turret, the majority of his encounter is about breaking him out. The slag that he'll blast onto the platform can actually be reflected back onto the turret, and with each player reflecting this effect, it will stack. Have someone who can drop combat, like priests, hunters, or rogues, or even night elves with their racial, grab an artillery shell and be ready to man the turret. If they're targeted by rapid fire, they can't get into the cannons, but by dropping combat, they lose their fixate from the boss. Everyone else, go stack under the boss and have the shaman drop his grounding totem, or have the warrior use mass spell reflect and watch the boss's stacks fly up. This debuff will stack 9 times, and 1 shell will bring him out if done correctly. Then just bring him to a cannon and spray him down. The last boss, Torva, also has some reflectable ground effects. The lightning effect on the platform can be reflected so long as you have the reflect buff up, and not only does it reflect per player, it stacks. Last stop in Gorgrond is Iron Docks. Nakgar and Makog can both be reflected here. With the reflect up, Reckless Provocation will not trigger the fear effect that would normally punish the party with. A warrior's spell reflect will only last 1 tick of the fear before being consumed, so hold on to your Berserker Rage for this ability. Makog's spell reflect is pretty stupid, as in, regardless of what difficulty it's on, it'll waste him. Rip Makog. Cast spell reflect and jump through any of his lava waves and he'll take himself out pretty hard. Even if Sanguine Sphere gets cast on him, he'll break the bubble and then proceed to murder himself. And finally we have Upper Blackrock Spire. Ubers has virtually no real tricks to it and no spells you can reflect that aren't pretty obvious on their own. I felt like I had to at least include one semi-broken aspect from this dungeon though. If you have your Army of the Dead so that it will taunt everything, use it on the first boss while nuking him down. The constant taunting prevents him from reactivating any of his power conduits. Good luck, have fun with all these shenanigans. There are actually a couple more I haven't explained here, but they're really only beneficial to groups attempting ridiculous times in challenge mode attempts. Some of these require a good deal of coordination from other group members, but if you can manage any of these on your own, then more power to you. Once again, thank you all for watching. I hope this guide helped. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll see you all next time with more tanking tips. Take it easy.